Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 news. There were all sorts of rumours swirling around Lewis Hamilton today. Some thought he was even going to announce his retirement from the sport. That has very clearly not happened at all. And if anything, there might be some positive news for Hamilton coming out of Ferrari, with Loic Serra leading the line on the technical department. Former Mercedes man working with Hamilton for many a year. Rumour has it that next year's car will be far more designed towards his driving style than what he is putting up with the SF25. What's going to happen next? Very much interested in your thoughts and a comment. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Let's crack right on. Few things with Red Bull. Pretty remarkable how out of Red Bull's last 65 wins, Max has 60 of them, although in recent years that's maybe not too much of a surprise. But speaking of some other interesting Red Bull news, we also have this. They are looking for a new senior strategy engineer. They've just put this on their LinkedIn, so if you guys want to apply, then you're welcome to do so. 16 as of yesterday when this was tweeted have already done so, and whoever was viewing this maybe not quite got the full skill set, but anyway, thought that was pretty funny to look at. Now, people are talking about this, right, because Hannah Schmidt is probably the most notable Red Bull strategist, let's say, on the pit wall, and she has good responsibility, as we know, and has done a great job. Now, it's always a debate, isn't it, with strategy, because in 2022, 2023, especially maybe early 2024, Red Bull's strategy looked unbelievable. They were so efficient with their execution, and everything they did turned to gold. Now, that usually happens if you have the best car and if you have the best driver. You can basically do whatever you want. Undercut, overcut, pit early, pit late. But usually Red Bull would make the right call when it comes to if it's raining, when to come in. Sochi 2021, an excellent example of that. And yeah, it's undeniable that Red Bull, Hannah Schmidt and the rest of the team over there have done a great job. It does feel like, with Jonathan Wheatley out of the organisation, that operationally they have slipped to some degree. Their pit stops aren't what they used to be. Their strategy isn't maybe what it used to be either. But as we know, when you don't have the best car, it can be more challenging to actually make a strategy work if you can't rely on Max overtaking cars for fun like he was doing a couple of years ago if he ended up being somewhere behind the pack. But it is interesting that they're getting a new strategy engineer. I think the reason for this is not because Hannah Schmidt is getting fired. It's likely to replace this man. This is Will Courtenay. You guys might remember a little while ago that McLaren have done it again. They've gone and got another one. We know that they brought in Rob Marshall, of course, who seemingly has absolutely turned around the McLaren ship in terms of car design over the last couple of years. And they've also decided to go out and get this guy, who's basically the head of strategy over at Red Bull. Not the most notable name or like well-known face, but still an important figure of that team. Now, McLaren secured his services, but there was a lengthy gardening leave period that Red Bull put him on before he can go and join McLaren. But in light of all of this, it looks like they are looking for a replacement in that situation. Also, another pretty remarkable story. I'll just spend about 15 seconds on this. But this guy, who used to be the CEO of Jumbo Supermarkets, who sponsored Max for a long time, has just been sent to jail for 2 years. And he was also involved in other motorsport stuff as well. So I thought that was kind of crazy. Now, someone who maybe got out of jail, or whatever you want to say, Christian Horner, he has been under pressure for a long time. And Bernie Ecclestone says that to some degree, he's still feeling the ill effect of that. We know that Bernie and Christian get on very well, good friends, and presumably they have been having conversations during this period. Ecclestone even went on to say that the likelihood of him, as in Horner, getting involved in the Alpine project is particularly slim indeed, or at least in maybe the manner that Horner would want, where there's some degree of ownership or whatever. So we'll see what time says on that. But I thought it was pretty remarkable that Ecclestone said that it was a bit ruthless of Red Bull to cut Horner in the way that they did, and maybe on some way they're right. But also, this is Red Bull's modus operandi, especially under the leadership of Christian Horner. They were the most ruthless team in the paddock by some margin. So, you know, if Horner creates that environment, okay, yeah, maybe he felt the wrath of the own organisation that he had on some level helped create. But there's no surprise that Red Bull were ruthless. This is what they do. And when it comes to Horner, it's a similar thing that happened. But it does seem like it took him by some surprise. He says that, you know, Ecclestone says that Horner's still in shock to some degree, kind of coming to terms with what it means for him, what next as well, where might he go, how might he try and get revenge, because I'm sure that Horner doesn't want to be done with Formula 1 just yet. I'm sure that he feels like he has more still to give to the sport. And look, maybe he leaves Red Bull at a pretty opportune time, given their recent downfall. There was also some drama coming out of Jacques Villeneuve. Now, this should probably be no surprise because Jacques Villeneuve has some hot takes and he is not afraid to say what they are. Look, I don't agree with Jacques on this one, but intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. He says that of all Max's teammates, Tsunoda is probably the worst of them all so far. We know that Max is exceptional, but then the drivers next to him have just not been good enough, and there's no point saying, oh, poor them. No, they're just not good enough. That's it. They're barely good. And that's what's happened with Tsunoda. He's had 4 or 5 years of experience already. He's had his best, and clearly it's not enough. That's it. He's been given this chance, and too bad. And he was wanting this chance. He was screaming for it. He was put in, and he didn't cut it. So, I mean, this is like, if you didn't tell me this was a Jacques Villeneuve quote, and then you gave me that, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that it was a Jacques Villeneuve quote. And look, it's obviously been a tricky season for Tsunoda. I do think that, you know, he wasn't exactly hard done by, but in the sense that he probably should have had this drive, in my opinion, before the season started. He would have had the time at testing in Bahrain. He would have the first couple of Grand Prix. To put him in after 2 rounds was unfair, I would say, on Lawson, and it was also unfair to some degree on Yuki, but it is what it is. He came in, he's not done a great job, he's crashed a couple of times, it's set his upgrades back, but equally, he's not had the same car as Max for some time. They finally got most of the upgrades on the car for him at the Hungarian Grand Prix, and he was the closest that anyone has been to Max at that circuit since Ricciardo in 2017. So we know that Yuki has got an awful lot still to prove, and we also know that if he doesn't in the second half of the season after the summer break, he is not keeping that drive in 2026, and possibly he won't keep a drive at all. But over the last few years, since Ricciardo stepped away, with some of the other drivers they've played around with, you know, Tsunoda the worst of them all, you know, I wouldn't really agree with that, especially not the way that Villeneuve says it, but maybe by the end of this season, we will get a better indication of where that actually does lie. These are the race winners last year to this year. Last year, as we know, from the middle of the season onwards, was absolute chaos, with the Mercedes somehow winning some things. The McLarens, of course, became the best car. But even then, Leclerc, Sainz, Verstappen, Russell, Verstappen, I mean, there were 5 Grand Prix in a row towards the end of last season McLaren didn't win any of, before Lando clutched up and won the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix to secure McLaren the Constructors' Championship. This year, as you can tell, there is absolutely no doubt who's winning that this time, and what sort of a run could McLaren potentially go on from now to the end of the season, with 4 straight 1-2 finishes since they turned up in Canada. Now, Lando Norris, remarkably enough, given that there are so many Grand Prix nowadays, compared to where they used to be, and Lando's now been with McLaren for several years. In Qatar, towards the end of this season, in the triple header right at the end of the season, Lando Norris will become the McLaren driver with the most Grand Prix starts. It's pretty surreal to think about this being true, but it is, and he will be set to overtake none other than David Coulthard. So this is actually the list of Grand Prix starts for McLaren drivers. Senna, 96 Grand Prix, Alonso, 94, Hamilton did 110 with the team, Hakkinen 131, Jenson Button 136, and David Coulthard in his 8 or so years with the team did 150 Grand Prix. Lando Norris will have 142 already, and by the end of the season he will surpass that number. So pretty remarkable to think about that's the case, and I guess it's also remarkable to think that not that many Grand Prix ago Lando was on a 0 in this column in the first, but now he's put together a fair few victories, as of course as Oscar Piastri now at 8 with 60 Grand Prix starts, and he's of course on his way up this list as well. Now, while things are looking great for McLaren, not so much for their long-time rival in Ferrari. Leclerc's rate of pole positions getting converted continues to be unfortunately woeful for him. It's certainly not been all his fault. Some of them have been. I think it's more an unfortunate stat than anything, but of his 27 pole positions that he secured, only 5 of them he has converted into victories. Remarkably though, if you count up Leclerc and Max's pole positions in this ground effect era, they have 49. The rest of the drivers combined only have 33. Those are the 2 prolific pole sitters of this era, and Hamilton is not one of them in this era, certainly is of all time. And there were some theories as to whether there was going to be some sort of big news coming out today. We know that the Hungarian Grand Prix was a disaster for him. It was a bad qualifying, it was a bad race. He said that it was useless. He talked about Ferrari, some weird things happening in the background at Ferrari that were pushing him to make that strange comment about getting replaced. There was some other discussion discussions on it as well. He said that he needs to take a step back over the summer break period. He reckoned there would be some tears, right? With the difficulties that he suffered so far and locking back in for the second half of the season. That was certainly the implication, but there were rumours about whether there was going to be some sort of announcement today, because Hamilton a little while ago now did this announcement around something happening on the 8th of August. Now, this even happened before the Hungarian Grand Prix, but people had kind of put 2 and 2 together and come up with 5 that Hamilton was going to retire today, and this is what he put on his social media. So this was the post that he made: "We've struck the match, now follow the smoke." So he posted this a little while ago. I think we talked about it at the time. Now, very evidently here, this is not some sort of, oh, I'm going to retire mid-season in a shock switch. It's obviously going to be an advert for something, isn't it? I don't really understand why people are so surprised that then he comes out today with this, with Almarv. So you guys might know Almarv is his, initially his non-alcoholic whiskey brand or whatever, and they've got a new version of that or something. So, no real surprise. That's what he's come out with today, and I'm sure it's perfectly good, and people are obviously happy in the replies that he hasn't retired in a shock move. It's tequila, isn't it, actually, not whiskey, so apologies for that error. But yeah, you know what I'm saying. People are like, oh, Hamilton's going to step away, but I don't really know why that was ever much of a consideration. People were throwing all stuff around yesterday, and people said there was going to be tears, don't do this to me, he's got some special announcement coming. When drivers have a special announcement, they're always trying to sell you something. It is what it is, and with that should be no surprise to anybody at all. But Hamilton ain't going anywhere, at least not yet, and I think his mindset is probably just to suffer out the second half of the season. It's been a big challenge at Ferrari. The cars are not getting better in his favour. This was that Bernie quote on saying like, oh, Horner's going to buy into Alpine. I think there's more chance of Lewis winning his 8th title than that happening, and we know that Bernie does not believe Lewis is winning his 8th title. But maybe, if there is a chance for it, next year is that opportunity for a couple of reasons that we'll get to here in a second. Now, Fred Vasseur talked about what the target is for Ferrari in the second half of the year. It's relatively straightforward. Get second in the Constructors and then win it next year. So, of course, that was their plan last year to get, to try and win it last year. They didn't. They came second, but win it this year. But it's always with Ferrari next year, and we'll see if next year actually ever is their year again. Vasseur says we all want to win the championship. We've made a decent step forward, but now we perhaps need a bit more time to put everything together. The 2026 challenge is a good opportunity. So it's pretty fascinating, right? Because I don't think anyone's going to deny that this Ferrari is one of the worst cars they've built in a rather long time. That's my perception of it anyway. Obviously since 2020 and stuff like that. But it feels that way, right? And they're second in the Constructors, which I guess isn't really terrible compared to sometimes where they've been over the last couple of years with Merc and Red Bull and then, of course, McLaren making some big progress last year. But is the Ferrari a better car than a Mercedes or a better car than a Red Bull? Certainly compared to where they were last year with respect to McLaren. I think, Ferrari have definitely dropped the ball, but they are still seconds. Their drivers have done a good job getting them to that point. Certainly with respect to Antonelli having a difficult time and Red Bull's sister driver not existing, basically, for most of the season in terms of scoring points. So Ferrari are still second in the championship. So maybe they will hang on to that and, at least on paper, have had a respectable season, despite the fact that the car has been an absolute nightmare to get on top of, and all the changes they've tried to fix it have not delivered what they wanted. And certainly that's been the case on Hamilton's side of the garage. But this was a comment made yesterday as I scrolled down, because I'm going to show you guys the article here in a second. To talk about 2026, how they're designing the car, how that may well help Hamilton compared to what he's experienced in the Grand Effect era. Now, Hamilton's undoubtedly one of the greatest drivers ever, but from the very start of this Grand Effect era, there was a question as to how well Hamilton, at the age that he was at that point, would be able to adapt to these Grand Effect cars. And we know that Hamilton just doesn't like them and doesn't get on especially well with them. That was the case at Mercedes, and it seems to still be the case here at Ferrari. We know that these cars are heavy, they're slow in the slow speed corners, they have a tendency to understeer in the low speed and then oversteer at the high speed because of the way that they generate the downforce. Mercedes and to some degree Ferrari this season were able to mitigate some of that effect with the flexibility of the front wing, but the technical directive removed that and potentially has hurt Hamilton's feeling even more. And look, you can say that the greatest driver ever, so one of them should be able to be adaptable to different cars, and I think Hamilton, certainly his race pace at Mercedes over the last couple of years, was still very impressive indeed. But the reality is it doesn't matter how good a driver is, they're always going to have their preferences. If you put Max in an understeery car, we know that Perez can be close to him, if not sometimes even faster, right? We've seen that at Baku over the years. So even, the best drivers, one of the best ever, whatever you want to say, you give them a car that they don't really like, they're not going to be as fast as they could be with a car that they're adapted to. And, winning a championship is often a combination of multiple factors. Being the best, having the best car, having a teammate that you can beat, executing well, but also being in a regulation cycle that happens to suit your style. And maybe if you're 20, you can adapt. Or when you're 40, that becomes far more challenging. So 2026 cars full stop. Before you even talk about whether Ferrari are going to design them for Hamilton, the question is whether they should fundamentally be cars that favour Hamilton's style more. The answer to that question is probably yes, with the removal of the Venturi tunnels and the effectively execution in a, let's say, very French sense of the ground effect era, getting rid of it effectively, it gets to a point where presumably the cars should suit Hamilton's style better. There's also been lots of talk about the braking mechanics of the Ferrari that have been far more challenging to get used to than he would like, and also the power steering that he apparently mentioned the first time that he was in the car, the engine braking that Ferrari often use a lot of. So there's lots of adaptation that has been necessary for Hamilton to even get pretty close to Leclerc this current season. But next year, of course, is when that will determine next year whether Hamilton has it within him to get the 8th title in the upcoming era of regulations or not. And the key point for 2026 is the way that Ferrari will look to design their car. Because Hamilton joined in 2025, this car was developed by Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc. Hamilton did not have any input into it, and he got into the car and wasn't especially happy with some of the things that he found. But we do know that over the last couple of years, Fred Vasseur has signed many individuals that have worked closely with Hamilton, Loic Serra, Jerome D'Ambrosio, and a couple of others as well, I think, that have come over from Mercedes that worked with Hamilton for a long time. Loic Serra being the key one of these, because he's leading up effectively the technical department now, and he worked for Hamilton with Hamilton for some time. So, of course, their optimism is there that next year is going to be better, but the feeling is that Hamilton will get some of his, what did he describe it as, DNA in the car. Hamilton said a while ago he wants some of that in next year's machine to feel that some of his preferences are being reflected in what the car actually does. Of course, Leclerc is equally going to feel that he should have some serious input as well, and I'm sure he will, but they will try to balance the car a little bit better for what Hamilton would like compared to maybe what Leclerc and Sainz inputted into the car in 2025. Whatever way you look at it, whether you think Hamilton's currently underperforming, which obviously he is compared to his own and others' expectations, you could trace some of that back to the design of the car, quite frankly, and maybe Hamilton's argument is, well, Leclerc helped design this car and look where we are, right? So maybe you should let me have, like, the reins, as it were. Of course, they don't design the car, but they can give feedback on the areas they would like to see. My opinion is here there's a few factors in play. Fundamentally, is Hamilton quick enough still to win a championship and be competitive at the top level? I think possibly in the right machine that is doable. I think that he could beat Leclerc over a season. If we went back to the 2021 cars, I think that is what could happen. I think they'd be pretty close, Hamilton and Leclerc. I think Leclerc's got a bit better since 21. I think Hamilton's not at the same peak that he was in 2021. But over a course of a season, in terms of not making mistakes and executing and scoring points consistently right at the front end, we know that Hamilton just tends to come alive more when he has the best car, or like a car that's right at the front. When Hamilton knows that there's a race to be won or a championship to be won, it seems like he's able to get extra, juice out of himself, as it were, in that point. So I think Hamilton could still do it if the circumstances were right. Qualifying performance is obviously a question mark, but maybe that will come back with a car that he's got more confidence in. So there's the Hamilton piece of the equation. The other piece is the new car designs in 2026 actually suiting him more or worse than before, right? And if they do, then that's, necessary if Hamilton wants to win the 8th. And then there's whether Ferrari actually designed the car around him, but maybe that's the third of the rungs, right? We're saying this could be a positive for Hamilton, that Ferrari might try and lean the car in his direction, but if he's not up to the task, and if the regulations just don't suit what he, used to have in the early days of his career, and then, of course, through the turbo hybrid era of the regulations, then it might not matter all that much. But very much interested to your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.